Hello. In today's lecture, we're covering American History, Chapter 10, Section 1. We will be talking about post-Civil War Reconstruction in the United States. So, prior to all of this happening, this Reconstruction, the United States went through a period of civil war. Now, slavery and states' rights in the South was the number one issue having to do with the Civil War. So, pretty much, long story short, Civil War, the North fought the South, and they split into basically two separate countries during the war. After the war, they have to figure out how they're going to come back together. So, this whole process of bringing the country back together is called Reconstruction. After the war, President Abraham Lincoln wanted to offer amnesty to anyone in the South who took an oath of loyalty to the United States. So basically, he said, if these people accept the end of slavery and they take an oath to the United States, he will basically pardon anyone who does that. Okay, so amnesty is a pardon for an entire group of people. So in Congress at the time, there was a group of Republicans. Today, they're known as radical Republicans. The goal of these Republicans, who were basically in power in Congress, they had a majority. Their goals were to prevent the leaders of the South from returning to power. So they didn't want these Southern aristocrats having a lot of power after the war. They wanted the Republican Party to be powerful in the South. And the Republican Party was very popular with African Americans. Okay, so the freed slaves supported the Republican Party. So keep that in mind as we go through this chapter. The federal government wanted to guarantee African Americans the right to vote in the South. Now, this is going to be a major issue going forward. In fact, it's going to be an issue that pretty much doesn't get solved until the 1960s. Okay, so it's going to go on for a really long time. A lot of these issues are going to keep reoccurring in our country. Okay, so basically, the country has to figure out how exactly is it going to reunite. So, what were the specific plans for Reconstruction? So, President Lincoln had his own plan. His plan was called the 10% plan. So, basically, where it gets its name from is that Lincoln said if 10% of a state's population, one of these states in the South, if 10% of their population took an oath to the United States, he would re-enter that state into the Union. So, he would let them come back into the United States. So all he required was 10%. That was his plan. The radical Republicans, they did not agree with Lincoln's plan. So they wanted to pass what was called the 50% plan. So basically, it's the same idea, but with 50% instead of 10. So states in the South, the population of those states, 50% of the people had to take an oath to the United States in order to let them back in. Now, 50% is a lot of people. So Lincoln's plan, he really wanted to get the country back together quickly. The radical Republicans did not, right? So they kind of wanted to drag it out and to sort of have things their own way. Okay, they actually passed this bill in Congress. However, it never became law because Lincoln never signed it. So Lincoln decided not to sign this bill, and then it actually, and we'll learn about some of this stuff in government as well, but he didn't sign the bill. And by the time that bill came up, it had expired. So it never became law. That's called a pocket veto. So you can think of it as Lincoln basically took that bill, he put it in his pocket, he wasn't going to sign it, and then it expired. In the South, there was also a group, they're called the Freedmen's Bureau. Okay, so when it talks about freedmen, think of that specifically. Freedmen, so people who were slaves before, who are going to now be free. This bureau is designed to help them sort of learn how to become ordinary citizens, right? They've never had to do anything like this before, right? They've always been slaves. They had everything sort of given to them in the sense that they didn't have a lot of choices, right? So people made their choices for them. Now they're going to be part of society, and they have to basically learn how to do this. Right, so the Freedmen's Bureau is going to help with that. They help them find work. They basically helped African Americans start communities and restart their lives. So sort of teach them how to be members of society. So they do this by building schools and trying to educate and teach as many of these freed slaves to read as possible. All right, so as some of you may know, after the Civil War, or very close to the end of the Civil War, President Lincoln was actually assassinated by a Southern sympathizer named John Wilkes Booth. So Lincoln was assassinated. His vice president, who was Andrew Johnson, then is going to take office. Now, Johnson and Lincoln are very different. So Johnson wasn't necessarily fond of Lincoln's plans for Reconstruction. So Johnson, President Johnson now, did offer to pardon all of the former citizens who took an oath of loyalty to the United States. So what else he was going to do is he was going to give these rich white Southerners back their property that they lost during the Civil War. So they lose their property during the Civil War, basically during all of these battles. The Northern soldiers take over their plantations. Johnson is going to give it back to them, which is really going to make the radical Republicans in Congress angry. So when Johnson does take office, basically what he required of the states for Reconstruction, he wanted every single state to reform their state government. So they had to create a new constitution. They also had to ratify the 13th Amendment. Okay, so the 13th Amendment made slavery illegal in all of the United States. So if they were going to become part of the United States again, they would have to basically make slavery illegal. And then he said that they were going to forgive all of the Civil War debts, which a lot of Northerners, especially the radical Republicans, didn't like. They thought that Johnson was sort of taking it easy on the Southerners. So during this time, a lot of these Southern state legislatures, so the people that make the laws in the states, they pass a series of laws that are known as the Black Codes. So basically, the goal of the Black Codes was to limit African Americans' rights. So it might be voting rights, property rights, working rights, whatever. Those are called the Black Codes. So the Black Codes eventually will lead into segregation and Jim Crow laws in the South, which we'll talk about that at a later date. All right, here's our last slide for this section. So the radical Republicans take over. Basically, the radical Republicans hate President Johnson, right? They don't like President Johnson, and they're going to do everything in their power to take back power in the South, right? They want to control what's going on in the South. They don't want the Democrats to be in charge because the Democrats are basically the people who promoted slavery and all of these things that caused the Civil War. So to override these Black Codes, Congress passes the Civil Rights Act of 1866. Basically, this sort of starts the ball rolling on getting African Americans their rights. So this allows them to own property, and it basically says they have to be treated equally in the court of law. All right, so that's going to be very important. They also create the 14th Amendment. Now, we've talked about a lot of amendments in this class over the past several months. The 14th Amendment is arguably the most important amendment out of any. All right, so the 14th Amendment prohibits states from taking away people's rights based on certain things. Okay, so basically, a state cannot take away a person's right without what's called due process of the law. Okay, that's going to be very important. And that's going to be really important in the coming chapters and units. And it's going to be very important once you guys take government. It's going to be a major, major part of government and American rights, right? So basically to say you can't take away a person's rights without due process of the law, which means without sort of taking the correct steps in doing so, right? You can't just take away someone's rights because you feel like it. You have to have a good reason. And then it guaranteed equal protection of the laws, which later on, the 14th Amendment is going to be very important, and it actually is sort of the reason that the civil rights movement during the 1960s is successful, right? That segregation ends because of equality of African Americans. And then the Military Reconstruction Act basically takes the southern states and it divides them into districts. And these districts are controlled by martial law, which means that the military controls pretty much everything that goes on, right? There's no government yet because their government was sort of dissolved after the Civil War. So the military is going to go in, and the military from the north goes into the south and sort of controls what's going on. Okay, so a lot of Southerners don't like this. However, the radical Republicans, this is probably one of the most important things that they do that helps them maintain power. And then Congress passes the 15th Amendment. This basically ensures African Americans the right to vote. Or it says that you can't deny someone's right to vote based on race or religion, things like this. So the 15th Amendment is going to be very, very important going forward, especially over the next 90 years where African Americans are still going to be fighting for the right to vote. Okay, thanks for listening.